Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. This week, I chat with Barry Burden about the state of election fairness in Wisconsin and across the country. Burden is a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is the director of the Elections Research Center. I talked with Burden about two big election-related issues in Wisconsin, redistricting and voter ID, as well as his overall confidence in the state of American elections.
Political parties have become more interested in trying to fix the rules to help themselves. And so while we're making these kind of good government reforms that lots of people agree on, parties also see that they are likely to get some advantage from manipulating the rules in one way or another. And that's the concerning thing, is when party leaders are trying to take advantage of the system.
Burden's research and teaching at the UW focuses on electoral politics and representation. He's written books and published numerous articles about politics in a variety of notable publications. Here's our chat from his office in North Hall, located on Bascom Hill. The Elections Research Center is a relatively new thing. It's since 2015. Can you talk a little bit about why this was founded, and were there any issues that kind of led this to being something that needed to exist?
So our department, the political science department at UW-Madison, has for many years been a kind of hotbed of expertise for people who study elections and political parties and public opinion. But there was never really an institution to organize that and capture all of that activity. And so about 3 years ago, we created the Elections Research Center to serve as a hub for all of the activity on campus beyond the political science department, more than just faculty, students, researchers, other interested folks who want to understand elections in the U.S. and in other countries. Some of this builds on earlier activities. There was something here for a number of years called the Wisconsin Advertising Project, or the WisCAD Project, where a faculty member had collected essentially all of the television advertising in presidential, gubernatorial, congressional races over a bunch of years. So we built on that foundation. But there are obviously new areas to reach into. We're really curious about online advertising. And so we have a faculty member investigating Facebook and Twitter advertisements, legal or otherwise. There are a number of legal issues around redistricting, voter identification, early voting, those kind of controversial topics. And then just the perennial questions about what are voters doing? How do voters make decisions? Will turnout be high or low? Well, what's happening that's different in 2018 or 2016? So it feels to us like there are a set of classic issues that people want to know about, but it's also current events. And so there are always new developments that keep the center hopping.
You mentioned kind of a tradition here at the UW of kind of studying elections in some sense. Where does that come from? Do you have any idea of the history of that?
I have a little bit of intuition, but some of it's mysterious and random. Departments around the country do develop their own specialties. They become good at some things. And early on, as early as the 1950s and 1960s, we had faculty who were experts in political parties and public opinion and those kinds of topics. So that there's a little bit of randomness in the early days. But I think also just being in a politically interesting state that is a swing state, being in the state capital, puts us very close to politics and gives us a lot of exposure to candidates and other kinds of national level forces that make their way through Wisconsin. So it's hard not to be interested in elections, or at least feel the effect of them if you live in Wisconsin.
What are some of the big questions in your mind that you're doing research right now that you're trying to kind of figure out?
Well, I think there are two topics that have gotten a lot of attention in Wisconsin over the last few years, in part because we want there to be more research to answer what are really pressing legal questions. One is around the effect of the voter ID law that was passed in Wisconsin. That was actually passed back in 2011, so about 7 years ago, but has been in legal limbo because of off and on lawsuits at the federal level and state level. Finally went into effect for the first time in a real way in the 2016 presidential election. That was also an election where Donald Trump surprisingly won the state. First Republican to do that in, I think, 8 consecutive presidential elections. So something was clearly different in 2016, and lots of folks wanted to know how much voter ID was responsible for that, played a role in that. So that's an area we might talk about where there's there's been some activity from researchers at our center. The other area where there's been a lot of interest is in redistricting, legislative redistricting. There's a case out of Wisconsin still sitting before the Supreme Court. That could come down any day here in June 2018. We've been waiting since they argued the case back in October. This also stretches back to 2011 when the districts were first put into place after the 2010 census. They've been challenged, and it's bounced around in court and finally made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. So we're eager to get a decision from the Supreme Court and understand what the new precedent might be going forward.
Do you have a sense of what the Supreme Court might say and when they might say it? I mean, that's always a guess by a lot of people. But I mean, what is your kind of feeling on where this is headed with the redistricting case?
Early on, it looked pretty straightforward. The court took the case. It actually moved it up in its docket to hear it earlier. It was in early October. They had oral argument, and that was sooner than we would have expected, just given where the case was in the lineup of things. So it looked like the court wanted to move, and there would be a decision, and maybe in time for the 2018 elections. That got complicated when months went by, and there was no ruling from the court. And then they added in a second, somewhat related case from Maryland, the Benezek case, which has some different issues. The case out of Wisconsin is about Republicans taking advantage of the process and diluting the votes of Democrats. The Maryland case is the opposite. It's Democrats putting it to Republicans. The Wisconsin case is about the entire state map. The Maryland case is about one district. The Wisconsin case is about the state legislature. The Maryland case is about congressional elections. So there's an opportunity there for the court to roll both of these cases together and have one large set of decisions, one set of opinions that could set precedent for both levels of government, but it slowed things down because the Maryland case was not heard until March, and the issues in the Maryland case, the argument is somewhat different. So I think the justices are at this time trying to figure out how to put together a majority where 5 or 6 justices might come together and write one opinion that could be decisive. Again, if it had been just the Wisconsin case, I think that would have been more straightforward. The Maryland case makes it more complicated. The decision really has to be handed down in June. This is the end of their term. If they're going to follow the normal process of hearing a case and issuing an opinion in the same term, it has to be this month. That will be unfortunately too late to affect the 2018 elections because candidates have already filed to run in Wisconsin elections, but it could presumably affect 2020. There is one outside possibility that the case gets delayed further. If the justices really can't come to any agreement on the Maryland and Wisconsin duo, they might kick it into the fall, re-argue the cases, maybe add a third case from North Carolina, and sit on that for a year. And so it might be June of 2019 that we're talking about this.
Is the fact that the Supreme Court is taking its time with these cases, does that indicate that it's a potentially groundbreaking decision that could be coming by the Supreme Court that could really make a huge impact on the future of elections in this country?
That could be what's happening. The time they're taking suggests they're being serious about it, that the case is not going to be simply dismissed because the plaintiffs don't have standing or there's some other administrative issue that holds it up. I think they're wrestling with legal arguments about what theory to apply in the case. So in the Wisconsin case, the plaintiffs argued basically that Republicans had discriminated against Democrats and violated their constitutional rights in 2 ways. One is under the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, saying they had really limited the ability of Democrats to exercise their freedoms in an equal way and exercise the right to vote in an equal way to Republicans. And the other was a First Amendment argument that the free speech rights of Democrats had been infringed by Republicans drawing the map. So there's sort of 2 things there, and there's some other parts of the argument that were specific, but those were the constitutional provisions. The Maryland case has a different theory. It's also a First Amendment case, but the argument is that Democrats there retaliated against Republicans on the basis of their views. And so it was discrimination based on a person's opinion, which we would not tolerate in most settings in the U.S. But it's a different First Amendment issue. So we've got at least 3 different constitutional provisions that could come into play, and they might be combined, or some might be set aside and others favored. And so I think it's there where particularly justices like Justice Kennedy, who's viewed as a swing justice and cares very much about the First Amendment, is trying to figure out what story to tell that could get together probably the 4 liberals on the court and 1 or 2 other justices to create a majority.
So if Justice Burden was on the case, if you were one of 9, What discussions would you be having with the other justices? What would your ruling be in that situation? What do you hope will come out of this?
Well, I'm sympathetic to the plaintiffs in both states that elections become ineffective as a way for people to express their preferences and have government be responsive to them if the districts that are drawn prevent the votes from translating into seats in the way that we might expect. It seems inherently unfair and a violation of at least norms, if not the law, that a decade could go by, and regardless of the partisan swings or changes in attitude or performance in office, that the incumbent party would pay no price for that. That's been the case in Wisconsin, where we've had good Republican years and good Democratic years all in the last decade, but the makeup of the state legislature has hardly changed. So I think there's a good argument that there's been a constitutional violation. The harder thing is then figuring out how far the party in charge of this process is allowed to go before it becomes unconstitutional. A little bit of partisan shenanigans is probably okay. They're the party in power. They get to draw the maps. If we're going to let politicians continue to do this, then they get to squeeze a little bit out of that. There's also something about the natural geography of where people live that gives one party an advantage in some cases. And at the moment, in most states, it's that Republicans have a natural advantage because Democratic voters tend to be packed very tightly into urban areas, college towns, other places like that. And so it's hard even for Democrats, if they're drawing the map, to adequately represent themselves in terms of seats. So I think even in Wisconsin today, if we had a computer drawing random neutral maps, Republicans would still have a slight advantage. But as being sympathetic to the plaintiffs, I think there's a line across which the parties in Maryland and Wisconsin have crossed to say we've gotten more than just a little bit of extra or what you might expect from a randomly drawn map. In the Wisconsin case in particular, there's a measure called the efficiency gap that's been offered as a standard that the justices might use. And the threshold that's been proposed in the case is something like 7%, meaning that if a party gets 7% more in seats than it should, given the vote, that might be a line we would cross. There aren't very many states that are that extreme. Wisconsin is, and some other states are. And so I would, if I were a justice, I would feel comfortable using something like that, or maybe a combination of measures as a way to decide what maps are off limits and which ones are acceptable.
Do you feel like we could ever get to a point where politicians aren't the ones drawing the lines? And after the census, could it be judges? Could it be somebody else? I mean, is that impossible in our system to get to a point like that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The cool thing about American elections is that states have a lot of control over what they do. They are laboratories, and they do a lot of experimentation. I think Iowa probably has the best system in the country. Since the 1970s, their congressional and state legislative lines have been drawn by a state agency, an agency that already exists, has expertise and personnel who know how to do this sort of thing. And when it comes time to draw the maps, they're told, here are the census data, make some new maps. We're not going to tell you where Democrats and Republicans live, and we're not going to tell you where incumbent politicians live, so you can't draw them in and out of districts. Produce some maps. And that agency generates maps, sends them to the state legislature, and the legislature has to vote for them up or down. No changes possible. That system has worked pretty well now for half a century in Iowa. It's not controversial. There are never lawsuits. It's inexpensive. It's very transparent. So sort of the opposite of Wisconsin and some other states. So I think Iowa is a wonderful system, and there have been some bills in the state legislature here in Wisconsin to introduce an Iowa-style system. But there are other models, too. A couple of states have citizens commissions that draw maps. Both California and Arizona today have these commissions. They tend to have some Democrats, some Republicans, and some independents or nonpartisan people serving on them. They spend months in public meetings and holding hearings and drawing maps, and then eventually produce one. And the legislature and the governor are really not part of that process. And that kind of model is being adopted in more states. There are some interesting things happening in Ohio and Florida and elsewhere. So Wisconsin right now is on the tail end of that. We are probably the least innovative when it comes to redistricting, at least these kinds of reforms, but it's something we could definitely move towards.
I remember when the redistricting process was happening in Wisconsin, Republicans kind of cloistered themselves away in a building across the street from the state capitol, did most of the work in private, and then just kind of dropped it on the state legislature, passed it relatively quickly. And I remember thinking at the time, like, why isn't the public more upset about it? It didn't seem like there was a huge reaction at the time. And I'm wondering what you've seen from the public's reaction to when gerrymandering happens, when a party goes too far in some of these cases where they're getting more seats than they deserve, according to election results. Does the public care, or are they just kind of buying into the fact that our team's winning or my team's losing? Does it really matter to them that it's done in a more bipartisan way, the redistricting?
Yeah, I think public opinion on this has changed. 10 years ago, if I talked to someone at a social event who was not an academic or not interested in politics like me, redistricting was not an issue that was on their minds. They weren't quite sure how that worked. They certainly didn't have strong feelings about it. Today, I hear from people on the street or someone I sit next to on an airplane or am waiting with at the shopping center. People have opinions about this and are pretty unhappy with the process in a lot of places. So I think it's risen, the way campaign finance and other issues have risen to be more top-tier issues, and there's a lot of concern about it. Now, you mentioned the process as it was going on in early 2011, and it seemed like people were not really concerned about the process. And I think that's right. And looking back, I can see why that would have been the case. On the one hand, it was happening in a private setting. It was off-site. It wasn't visible to the public. There weren't lots of open hearings. It was in a private law firm. So it wasn't visible, and there weren't things for journalists really to write about or for the public to see. So that sort of takes it off the radar screen. The other, if we think back to that time period, there was a lot going on in Wisconsin politics that was a serious distraction. The debate over Act 10, which began essentially in Valentine's Day, 2011, a few months after Walker's election, really took over the state capitol. There were protests, thousands of people marching around the capitol. 14 Democratic state senators left and went to Illinois for a couple of weeks. There were legal battles, and there ended up being recall elections. And so I think and lots of legislation being passed also in that spring and summer. So I think in the midst of all of that, some quiet redistricting activity that was happening in a law firm across the street just didn't get the same kind of pickup. But I think the public began to notice after the next set of elections happened in 2012. That would have been the first cycle. That was a really good year for Democrats. Barack Obama won the state by, I think, 7 percentage points. Tammy Baldwin defeated Tommy Thompson in the U.S. Senate race. So at the top of the ticket, Democrats were doing really well. And actually, they did pretty well if you go down the ticket, too, in the state assembly races. Democrats won something like 170,000 more votes than Republicans did. But Republicans got about 2/3 of the seats in the assembly out of that. So I think that was the first time that the public and maybe journalists noticed, wow, there's a major disconnect between how the votes are coming in and how that translates into seats in the legislature. So I think from that time forward, it's really become a bigger and bigger issue.
Throughout our history in the U.S. government, there's been shenanigans, there's been voter suppression, there's been, inequality in voting system that we've kind of stamped out over time. And but there's always been a certain level of problems with our election system. But the Republicans kind of rolled on, and it's been okay. There's been arguments about things. There's Supreme Court cases, but we've kind of kept going and been a successful government for the most part. Do you feel like we're getting to a point where the future is starting to look a little bit stormy if we continue down the path that we're going with some of our current election system?
I'll say it's a mixed bag. There are things going in different directions simultaneously. Over the long haul, things have improved tremendously. As you say, suffrage has been expanded to groups, African Americans, women, 18-year-olds, in some cases felons who were not eligible in the past. The electoral system has become more open. People can register to vote in person, by mail, at the polls, online, in a lot of states. Some states are actually automatically registering people to vote now. Polling hours have expanded. We now have early voting and long days of voting and just a whole range of innovations that have really made elections, I think, more democratic and fairer and more transparent. And a lot of those innovations have actually happened since the 2000 election and that famous meltdown in Florida and the Bush v. Gore race. There were a lot of reforms passed at the state level and national level since then. Voting machines have been replaced. The old systems that didn't work and had the problems that we saw in Florida have essentially been purged and replaced with new, better voting machines. So I think the big story is a positive one. Things are moving in the right direction. The other side of that is that political parties have become more interested in trying to fix the rules to help themselves. And so while we're making these kind of good government reforms that lots of people agree on, parties also see that they are likely to get some advantage from manipulating the rules in one way or another. And that's the concerning thing, is when party leaders are trying to take advantage of the system. Now, it's hard to know always when a party leader is doing something out of principle. They think it's good for the electoral system, and when they think it's just good for their party. Sometimes those things go together, sometimes not. The other part of that we've discovered in some of our research is that parties aren't always good about figuring out what works to their advantage. And here's an example. Early voting has taken off across the states, including in Wisconsin, especially since the Florida election back in 2000. So there have been changes in state laws to make early voting more possible. Political parties have really pushed it. Voters have really taken to it. Something like 40 to 45% of all ballots are now cast before Election Day. That's a lot of early voting. Democrats are pretty sure that this helps them, that their voters get out and take advantage of early voting, and Republicans are pretty sure that it hurts them. So as you go from state to state, you see Democrats pushing for more early voting opportunities, expanding that right, and Republicans trying to restrain, control, or limit it. But our research shows actually they're pretty wrong about that. There's not really evidence that Democrats benefit from early voting. In some states, they're actually harmed by it. And so it's not clear that the parties know what's good for them when it comes to making these kinds of reforms. And I think there are others that are more obvious. I think voter ID, campaign finance, you might see more clear partisan implications from those. But in other cases, parties aren't quite sure what's good for them. And so that's one salvation, actually, that parties are just a little bit underinformed. And that helps break the link just a little bit between their partisan motivations and what kinds of election changes we see.
I guess, when some of these cases that are obviously that the party, one part or the other, is trying to kind of fix the election in some way, or I don't know if the fix is the right word, but to tilt the election in their favor when they pass legislation to do that. How do you hold those elected officials accountable? It doesn't seem like anybody's going to the polls to vote them out because of a certain piece of legislation right now. And also the balance is tilted in their favor if the legislation worked, or if it didn't work, then maybe not. But how do you hold them accountable for things like this? How does the public do that?
Yeah, it's really hard. If you think about redistricting as an example, to go back to that, if one party locks themselves into the majority by drawing districts in the year after the census that advantage them, there's no opportunity for voters to replace those people, or it's very difficult. There has to be a tremendous wave to overtake the districts that have been drawn. So where this has moved is from the legislative process and from the electoral process to the courts. There's now more litigation going on at the federal level and state level than ever before. This is one of the things that's happened since the Florida election in 2000, is that litigants feel like that's the place to solve the problem. Redistricting, where does it sit today? It's at the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's because there have been cases filed in state and federal court that have worked their way up. The voter ID disputes that have gone on started as local disagreements that work their way into federal cases, including one that went to the Supreme Court. So that's where the battles have happened. I think Democratic and liberal-leaning groups have been more active on that front, funding activity, groups like the ACLU or the NAACP or the Democratic Party working in courts to file suit. But that's mostly because it's been Republicans who have been in power, especially since the 2010 election. And so Republicans have enacted the kinds of things they want in a lot of states, including Wisconsin. Groups that are opposed to them then file suit in court, and we let that process work its way out. In some cases, it's 7, 8, 9 years till we find the result.
Well, let's talk about voter ID a little bit. What do you think was the Republicans' intent when they passed that legislation, and did it work in their favor?
So there has always been some form of identification. But I think Republicans rightly see the process as improvable and see that voters and people are required to show identification in other parts of their life. And so why not impose what they view as a common sense reform that would improve the security of elections and maybe boost the confidence that people have in the electoral system? At the same time, I think Republicans often believe that it will advantage their side, that the people who will have more difficulty working their way through the identification process are people who are likely to vote Democratic. We've seen once in a while that kind of thought leak out in how Republican legislators think about it. think the most famous one was the Speaker of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, who talked about advantaging his party in the 2012 presidential election by having voter ID in place. This happened in North Carolina. I think there's some inklings of that in Wisconsin as well. So this is a nice place where the partisan motivations and the philosophical views kind of line up. And so there's not a conflict for a lot of Republicans. If it helps their party, that's great. But they also think it's a good thing for the election system. So that's why I think we've seen this wave of activity. And ironically, this also goes back to the Florida election in 2000. As part of the legislation that got passed to fix what happened in Florida, there were a lot of good things done there. But with any legislation, there are some other things that get inserted into the bill that maybe weren't immediate reactions to that or come from a different kind of motivation. And one of those was a voter ID requirement for people who have registered to vote by mail but have never been to the polls before. So that the law that got passed, known as the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, required people in that instance to show ID. And that just raised an issue for a lot of Republicans in Washington. Oh, if we're requiring identification of first-time registrants when they go to the polls that initial time, why aren't we requiring ID of everyone? And I'm being required to show ID at all kinds of places in my daily life, going to the movies or picking up a prescription or whatever it would be. And so why can't we ask people to show a driver's license or passport or student ID or something else? That was really in the 2011-12 period, the hot reform that was crossing across the states.
So this was in place for 2016 election, the presidential election in Wisconsin. What was kind of the impact, you think, of voter ID on that election in this state?
Well, the ID law was in effect in 2016, and it was a surprising election. And so a lot of people have wondered what role the ID law played in that outcome, with Trump winning in a way that other Republicans, Reagan, Bush, Romney, McCain, couldn't do. There's some magic in the air in 2016 for Republicans, and could voter ID have played a role in that? From all the research I've seen, we're pretty sure that it played a role. What's difficult to quantify is how big that role was. Democratic turnout was down in Wisconsin in 2016, particularly among African Americans in Milwaukee especially, and also among young people. Not so much in Madison, but in other parts of the state. And so it's hard to know whether the lower turnout among those two groups is attributable to the voter ID requirement, or it's attributable to the fact that they were just not engaged in the campaign. The Clinton campaign I think didn't generate the same excitement among minority communities and young people that the Obama campaigns had in 2008 and 2012. She famously didn't visit the state during the general election, but there also really wasn't much infrastructure in the state for the Clinton campaign. She occasionally sent surrogates like Tim Kaine, her running mate, through the state, but there weren't field offices set up the way the Obama campaign had. There really was not campaign advertising. She was running no ads until very close to Election Day. And so I think the lack of engagement by the Clinton campaign could explain a lot of the depressed turnout among minority residents, especially in Milwaukee again, and young people. But we also know that those two groups are groups that are less likely to have ID in the first place. And so they're more vulnerable than other voters when there's a requirement like this put into place. The other related aspect of that is when the law was passed in 2011, there was a requirement in the legislation that the state do a public education campaign. And right away, the state did that. The old Government Accountability Board, which oversaw elections at the time, contracted with a PR firm, and they created radio ads, billboards, television spots. But those basically sat in mothballs while the legislation was being debated in court over the next 5 years. Finally, the law goes into effect in 2016. Now there's no money to fund the campaign. So those ads are sitting there, but the GAB doesn't have a way to put them on the air or put them in public view. So how does the public find out about the law? News coverage is one way. Though we have to admit the coverage is confusing. The law is on, the law is off. The back and forth nature of it, and actually some changes that got made to the law in between, led the public, I think, to misunderstand whether it was in place or not. The Marquette poll in Wisconsin showed that some members of the public thought it was in effect when it wasn't, and didn't think it was in effect when it was. So a lot of the advertising was voluntary. The GAB asked television stations and radio stations to play the PSAs for free as a public service. There was little of that. I think in Milwaukee, there were some advertisements run in movie theaters along with the trailers before the film showed. That was limited in its effect. So the kind of public rollout of educational materials didn't happen in the way that the law expected or that we've seen in a lot of other states. So that too could contribute to voters who, especially the ones who aren't tuned into the day-to-day political news, to not understand what was required of them in 2016.
We had another recent election in Wisconsin since then, which is the Supreme Court election. Obviously, smaller turnout for that one, but were you able to collect any data on the effects of voter ID in that election in Wisconsin?
I wouldn't use the Supreme Court race as a good barometer. It's first of all, it's a nonpartisan race, at least officially. Second is it happens at a time of year and under circumstances where the people who participate are really diehard voters who have a lot of resources, are very engaged, have long voting histories. Those are exactly the people who are least likely to be affected by the law. So I think still the best place to go is back to the 2016 presidential election to try to understand what happened. And one of my colleagues, Ken Mayer, has done a study of what happened there. It's not a complete study of the state, but it's one of the only serious social science looks at what effect voter ID would have had. So let me tell you how this study worked. So it's difficult because you're trying to measure something that didn't happen. These are people who did not vote, potentially because of the voter ID requirement. Either they didn't understand the law and didn't think they had ID when in fact that was acceptable when they did, or they understood the law and just realized that they were not going to be able to get ID, or they objected to the ID law and didn't participate for that reason. So you're trying to capture something that is not in the voter record because these people didn't participate. So the way Ken Mayer went about this was to find people in the voter registration rolls in two counties, Dane and Milwaukee, which are the two most populous counties, people who were registered to vote. So we know they're eligible. They've already been deemed to be citizens and 18 and residents of the state, but didn't participate in 2016. And he sent them a mail survey that he designed working with the UW Survey Center and asked them a variety of questions about their demographics, about their attitudes about elections, what they knew about the voter ID law, what kinds of ID they had, other kinds of things, and then analyze those data to try to understand how many of them seem to be likely non-voters because of the ID law. And he developed two standards out of those data. One standard was a looser standard. These would be people who either didn't have ID or said that the ID law was one of the factors that contributed to their non-voting. So not the only factor, but it was a consideration. Then there's a second set who, under a stricter definition, didn't have ID or said the ID law was the main reason they didn't vote. Under the looser standard, it's about 11% of non-voters who say they didn't vote because of the ID law. Under the stricter standard, it's about 6%. Now, this is not 11 and 6% of the whole state. It's only 11 and 6% of these two counties. And it's not even 11 and 6% of the whole county. It's of non-voters. So if you want to translate into what is the effect of that on a grand scale, a 6 or 11% is probably something like 1 or 2% of voters who would have been deterred or somehow dissuaded because of the ID law. We don't know if that generalizes to other counties in the state. Milwaukee and Madison are different in a lot of ways. They're more urban, they're more diverse, and so on. They tend to be younger than other parts of the state. But it's at least tens of thousands, I think, would be a reasonable extrapolation to the rest of the state. So it's not all of the explanation for why Democrats didn't do well in 2016, but it's a factor along with 100 other things, including the actions of the Clinton campaign.
Yeah, that really speaks to, I think, that maybe the challenge of what you do is there's what is the important data? You always have to figure out what is the important data. And there are 100 different factors that you could maybe point to as determining the outcome of an election. So how do you figure it out in your mind, what to study, how to study it? What are some of those challenges that you face? And also, we have a decentralized voting system in this country, and from state to state, it's very different. So how do you get accurate, usable data?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a person who's not engaged in this every day thinks they're just data sets sitting around for us to analyze. I've had a lot of people ask since the 2016 election, what was black turnout and white turnout in Wisconsin in 2016? We don't know. There's not an answer to that. There's not an answer to that. The state doesn't record the race of the person who registers to vote. So the state of Wisconsin can't tell us what black and white turnout was. We don't really have good statewide surveys that capture black and white voters and black and white non-voters. So there's just a really basic question that could help us understand the dynamics of the election and what was different about it, and inequality and participation and everything else. And the data aren't there. So that's a frustration, but it also lets a researcher be creative. And the study that Ken Mayer did about voter ID was a creative way to try to answer a really hard question, using a mail survey to contact people who were registered but didn't vote and ask them a series of questions. And there were a lot of other technical issues and kind of dealing with the response rate and people who had died since the election and trying to deal with that kind of attrition in the population or people who have moved out of state, other kinds of considerations. So it's hard, but I think that's one of the joys of this process, is that you get to think about things in a creative way and brainstorm ways to get angles on questions that are otherwise hard to address. This, too, has been one change since the 2000 election in Florida. We now have better data and more data than ever before. One of the things that the legislation coming out of the Florida debacle created was a new agency at the federal level called the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission, the EAC. The EAC collects data from every community around the country after every federal election, asking a whole range of things. They want to know things like turnout and registration, but also absentee ballots, how many military ballots were cast, how many provisional ballots. And so we have this now really rich and high-quality resource that is available every 2 years that provides a kind of transparency and comparability across jurisdictions, counties and states and towns and other units that didn't exist 15 or 20 years ago. So the data continue to improve, but it doesn't mean we have everything we would like.
We've been talking a lot about the kind of partisan back and forth on a lot of these election decisions of how we run elections. But I think there's also a lot of things that you probably study that are just like, how do you do this smarter? How do you do this better, more efficiently in a modern society? What are some of those things that you're looking at or you're interested in, or things that you would say that let's just do this? Like, what are some of those recommendations to make our voting system better in this country?
Well, there are a few easy answers to that. One that Wisconsin already does is election day registration. Wisconsin was one of the first states back in the 1970s to allow people to register at the polls on election day and cast a ballot right on the spot. And that actually is one of the reforms that now a number of states have picked up. I think we're up to 10 or 12 states at this point. And I think that's a no-brainer in terms of reforms. It obviously works administratively. Wisconsin has somehow managed to do this without falling apart or creating long lines at the polls. In fact, we have some of the shortest lines in the country. And I think it has benefits for everybody. If you're on the conservative end of the spectrum and you're concerned about security and fraud and voters doing things they shouldn't do, actually, election day registration is one of the most secure forms of registration there is. Unlike, say, registration forms that get mailed in or collected by a third-party group, it's done at a polling place in a public facility with poll workers from both parties watching and other voters and observers and journalists in the room and trained officials running through this process. So it has a kind of scrutiny that other voter registration processes don't. It also keeps the rolls up to date. And I think anyone with concerns about security wants the rolls to be accurate and current. And election day registration allows a person to update at that moment their address, name, or whatever else needs to be changed. And I think if you're on the more liberal end of the spectrum and you're concerned about voters having access to the polls and not having their votes suppressed, election day registration lets people make a change to their registration status right at the last moment and do both the registration step and the voting step all in one action. Right? It's one-stop shopping. You register and you vote in one place rather than having two separate things that a voter has to do. And it's worked so well for so long in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Maine and some other places, and now is taking off in other states. That's one I think that's really a no-brainer, and it's just a kind of win-win for both the quality of the data that the state maintains, the convenience and confidence it gives a voter, the accuracy of the voter file that it there's just a lot of benefits. So that's one easy one. I think the other one that's gotten a lot of attention this year is the use of paper ballots. We know after the 2016 election that there are increased concerns about the security of the voting system. There are still some states around the country that have electronic machines with no paper backup. So if those fail or they are targeted for mischief, There's no way in a lot of jurisdictions to go back and do an audit or a recount or anything else. Wisconsin at least has the benefit of having a paper ballot everywhere. Most of the state voters are voting on an optical scan ballot. It looks like an SAT test, filling in a bubble or connecting an arrow with a pen and then feeding that into a scanner. The scanner is doing an electronic count, but all the paper ballots are sitting inside that machine. If there's any doubt about what's happened on Election Day, or the electricity goes out, or the machine fails, or there's a concern about hacking, just open it up and count the ballots. And in fact, we've done that twice in recent Wisconsin elections. After the 2016 presidential election, the state did a full statewide recount, a lot of that by hand of paper ballots. No other state in the country did that in 2016. And also, if people remember back in 2011, after the Supreme Court race that happened that spring, that tumultuous spring in Wisconsin, there was also a statewide hand recount of every ballot in the state. Millions of votes being counted by hand in those cases. I think those recounts showed that the process in Wisconsin is not perfect, but it's at least transparent and auditable, and where there are errors, we can identify them and go in and fix them. So, if there were two things I were to recommend to a state today, it would be paper ballots for sure. Do that immediately, and think about some form of Election Day or same-day voter registration.
Are there things that we can learn from other countries in regards to how to run an accurate, efficient voting system?
Wow, there's so much variation around the world. The U.S. is totally unusual, so decentralized. The federal government in the Constitution has basically given the control over elections to states. States do a variety of things, and many of them hand over control to counties or localities. In some states, elections are happening entirely by mail. There are no polling places at all. In places like Oregon, everyone gets the ballot by mail without asking for it, every registered voter, and they either drive it in, drop it off in a drop box, or mail it back. That's very different from, say, Pennsylvania, where everyone votes at a polling place, your neighborhood polling place. There's very little absentee voting. Some states like Wisconsin have Election Day registration. Others have a more difficult registration process. Some have touchscreen machines. Some are voting on old-fashioned paper ballots or something else. So there's a lot of variation. So I think some standardization would not be bad to just have a somewhat more common experience across the country, especially when there's a federal election going on where everyone is voting on the same office or people who are going to go serve in Congress together, to have a little more uniformity in the kind of voting experiences and opportunities people have. The other way the U.S. system is unusual is the length of the ballot. Not so much in Wisconsin. I think we're pretty good about this. In other countries, the ballot is often one race. It's your member of parliament who's being selected, one legislator, and that's it. And in Wisconsin, in a lot of states, there's a presidential race at the top of the ticket, and then a governor's race, a congressional race, a state legislator, a mayor, some other statewide offices, county commissioners, township officials, dog catcher, mosquito abatement control officer, ballot initiatives, referendums, tax issues. In places like California, the ballot has become totally unwieldy. It's pages and pages, and sometimes in multiple languages because of the language needs of the population. This is a very complicated ballot, and it seems impossible, even for a geek like me, to be up to speed on who all these judicial candidates are, or technical ballot issues dealing with kind of complicated issues like insurance reform or legal procedures, those kinds of things. So I think simplifying the ballot, reducing the number of offices that are up for election, and reducing some of the direct democracy kinds of elements in some of the states out west in particular would be helpful.
So how did you become an elections geek, as you say? Why is this something that you feel passionate enough to study and to research and to talk about and write about? Why?
It's hard for me to imagine doing anything else. I'm interested in politics and government and civil society, and I think elections are at the center of that. You don't have a fully functioning, successful democracy if you don't have free and fair elections. It's also the place where the rubber hits the road, right? Politicians talk and spin, and there's news coverage and efforts by groups to try to influence the debate that's going on. At some point, though, there's a vote where the voters get to weigh in and make a decision about whether to keep the people who are in office or replace them with someone else. And that's the ultimate authority, right? The consent of the governed. This comes right out of the Declaration of Independence. So I think this is the place that good politics starts, is with elections. So it's hard for me to imagine studying political science or government and not making elections the center of that. I also worked on campaigns when I was a younger person in college and graduate school. It was fun. and I'm glad I'm not in that world anymore, that I'm studying it rather than being part of it. But I realized there are just lots of people involved in that industry. For a lot of voters, it's a once every 4-year kind of activity. But for others, it's a kind of continual process. Obviously, there are professionals who run elections, who work in state or county governments, and that's their job. But there are also people working for parties and campaigns. When we run a presidential election in this country, the best estimates are that there are something like 1 million poll workers. 1 million poll workers. Those are volunteers who get paid a modest amount to go work, often a long shift, to run this one-day activity. There's nothing else like that in American society. There's no other startup or pop-up enterprise that can mobilize that many people at a local level. They have to be everywhere. Anywhere there's a person who can be a voter, and there are still polling places, you have to have a poll worker. And so it's a remarkably large share of the population that's engaged in this. As many as the number of people who say work at Walmart or who are in active duty military at sometimes are serving as local election officials, essentially. And that's just a really important and impressive process.
Can you tell me a little bit about some of the campaigns you worked on and maybe what you got out of that experience? Any good campaign trail stories?
As a college student, I worked on every kind of campaign you can imagine, from presidential campaigns down to congressional and county races. My main lesson was it's not glamorous. It's really boring behind the scenes. It's a lot of grunt work. It's walking door to door, handing out literature, making phone calls. I remember stuffing envelopes for hours, organizing people. It's a human activity, and that makes it complicated. Let's see, good war stories. I sort of associate the holiday of Halloween with Election Day because they're close together. Election Day is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So it can be anywhere from November 2nd to November 8th or so. So it's usually within a week of Halloween. So as you're going from door to door, it's kind of the blustery fall day, typically if you're in late October, but also the Halloween decorations are out. So you're making your way around pumpkins and ghosts and fake tombstones that are in people's yards. And if you're out in the early evening, even on Halloween itself, you might find trick-or-treaters going through the streets. So there's this kind of festive atmosphere that there's this other thing going on. And most people pretty reasonably would rather focus on that fun than what's going on in the election. So trying to get their attention away from those kinds of, family and local activities to focus on the campaign is always a challenge.
What is your earliest memory of voting? Did your parents make that an issue, something to prioritize in their lives, or where did this kind of interest in politics come from?
It's a good question. It was not a priority in my household. We were not a political household. We didn't talk about politics. Never went to the polls with my parents or family members. I'm not sure they were regular voters, in fact. So it's something that just happened in me at some point. But there were probably a couple of things that happened in my teens that sort of set me on this path. One was that, like a lot of high school seniors, I took a required civics course, U.S. government course. It was terrible. It was a terrible course. The instructor was not there most of the time. He told us he had gone into teaching because he didn't want to serve in Vietnam. And this was a way to get out of that. So he wasn't really committed to the teaching profession. And so it ended up being a kind of chaotic course where we were on our own. And I and a few other students were actually interested in politics. So we spent some time reading the textbook. We did very well on the few exams that happened. I remember at the end of that course, there were a couple things that happened. One is that we had a mock presidential debate where we broke into teams and pretended we were the candidates in the 1988 presidential campaign. And that was really fun. That was the first campaign I would have noticed. I would have been 17 at the time. The other is that my small hometown in Ohio had a visit from Dan Quayle, who was the running mate in the 88 campaign along with George H.W. Bush. This never happens, at least to that point. Even though we were in a swing state, my town just was not big enough and wasn't a swing part of the state, and so it didn't attract presidential candidates. But there we were with the vice presidential running mate coming to town, and we took a field trip, my government course, trucked off to the local high school and heard Quayle speak. And there were a number of other Republican proxies there, cabinet secretaries and other people who spoke on the Bush team's behalf. And there was a band playing and there were banners and people had made their own signs. And it was just an environment I had never seen before. And I thought, well, this is interesting. There's something just like there's a part of society that I have not been privy to. And when you're 16 and 17 to see those kinds of new experiences, it's enticing. And so I think probably those few things that happened right at the end of my high school experience probably put me on a path.
You mentioned in high school you had a teacher that wasn't necessarily good at maybe teaching some of these things, but now you're in a position where you're teaching, working with young people. What do you want to impact on them, the students that go here to UW-Madison, about elections, about the importance of elections? What kind of messages are you trying to deliver to them?
It's probably a multifaceted message. I think everyone at the university wants our students to be informed and engaged. And that's sort of wrapped up in the mission of the university. We want to train people to be good citizens. They're all of voting age at this point. So if they're U.S. citizens, we would like them to vote in elections and have their voice heard. And young people in particular are not great at voting, never have been. They have the lowest voter turnout rate of any age group. We know from surveys over the years that the voting rate tends to go up as a person gets older. The rough rule of thumb is that the rate at which a group votes is sort of proportional to its age. So about 20% of 20-year-olds and about 40% of 40-year-olds and about 60% of 60-year-olds would vote in a presidential election. So there's a pretty steep curve as you get older. And we would like to put young people higher up on that curve early on. So giving them the set of skills and motivations to get out there and take advantage of the electoral process. But also beyond voting, just to be good, critical consumers of the news and current affairs, to understand what's happening, to be open-eyed about it and not have a knee-jerk reaction, as a partisan to the news. One example that came up a couple weeks ago was the news item that was circulating about young immigrant children who the federal government had lost track of. And there was a headline that something like 1,500 young people who I think were not citizens had come to this country and the U.S. government had lost them. Well, people had very strong reactions to that headline, depending on how they thought about immigration and the Trump administration. But the headline turned out to be misleading. If you dug into the story, it was more complicated than that. I want our students to be smart enough and competent and curious enough that they'll do that digging in and get beyond simply reposting or retweeting headlines in a way that makes them feel good. That's the easy thing to do. And hopefully we can train our students to do the thing that's a little bit harder and more complicated, but more rewarding and better for the system.
Now I want you to think forward a little bit. So 20 years from now, maybe 30 years from now, how do you think voting in this country will be different, taking into effect our partisan divide right now and maybe where it's going? How do you see voting in the future here in this country?
It will not be the same as today. We know the voting process evolves. It's evolved since the early days of the Republic. For the first century of U.S. history, the government didn't even produce ballots. Parties made them. And they were printed in newspapers or handed out by ward bosses. There was no voter registration for the first 100 years. Women couldn't vote. U.S. senators were not directly elected. So things that we can't imagine elections being without today were actually a large part of American history. And this kind of acceleration of changes since the Florida meltdown in 2000, I think suggests we're going to continue to see changes. 10 or 20 years from now, things will be different. I suspect there'll be more voting by mail. That has really just taken off across the country. And actually, voting by mail is sort of the wrong way to describe it. It's distributing ballots by mail. They go out automatically to people. But actually, most voters return them in person. They like to drop them off. And this is really the dominant way that voters get ballots on the West Coast. In California, Arizona, Oregon, Washington, ballots are just going out automatically to every registered voter. Nobody requests it, and they return them however they like. And so it's a long voting process. It's weeks. It's not a day. So I'm not sure it's the most efficient process on every dimension, but it has a lot of benefits for voters, for security, for cost savings and convenience. Campaigns like it because they can track voters and understand what's happening there. So I think we'll see more of that in Wisconsin and in other parts of the country. But I think beyond that, probably other technological innovations. The voter registration files that every state maintains are being watched and maintained and pruned in a more sophisticated way all the time. I think that will continue. Because there are concerns about security and potential hacking, I think there's going to be more attention on the integrity of those voter files. The place I think we're not going for a long time is voting on the internet. There's a lot of interest in doing that, and for a lot of people, it seems like a common sense reform. That is still a long ways away. We may be at the point where some ballots are being sent out via the internet. And today we even have some military personnel who are allowed to return them via email, but they're not actually submitted for counting via an internet kind of process. So I think surprisingly, that's the one place we're probably not going. And we're actually relying on some older technologies like the U.S. Postal Service as a way to get ballots back and forth.
Is there anything else that I should have asked or things that you're thinking about in regard to your work?
I think one of the things we're watching this year, and I've done some research on, is the fate of female candidates for office. There was a lot of interest in that in 2016 because we had the first ever major party female presidential candidate in Hillary Clinton, and she lost. This year, 2018, looks like it's going to be a great year for female candidates. It's sort of a follow-up to the Year of the Woman that happened back in 1992. This may be a second Year of the Woman, especially on the Democratic side. And a lot of these Democratic primaries, female candidates are doing very well, winning as much as men, maybe more. And it looks like there are going to be a lot of new women elected to office. So trying to understand what drives people to run for office and why women have come out as candidates in a way they had not in previous cycles, really interesting. One of my colleagues and I have done some experiments in surveys to try to see how voters respond to male and female candidates. In some cases, in presidential elections in particular, when we run hypothetical candidates for them in a survey, voters actually are biased against the female candidate by a couple of percentage points. All else constant, we have all the other traits of the candidates randomly varied as well. But in state and local elections, female candidates actually get an advantage. They get a boost. And 2018 is about congressional and state and local candidates. So that too suggests women have, the wind at their backs probably in 2018. So I think that's going to be an important trend to watch this year.
It was a pleasure to stop in and talk to Barry Burden at a busy Bascom Hill. Lots of people walking by. You might have heard a few of them in the background of our conversation. But it was a really cool setting for an interview. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. You can also stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at WisPodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.